Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behavior as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm looking at confidence. You know, that thing we're told that we need to have to succeed. But it's not always a good thing. From a human risk perspective, overconfidence is what leads people to do things that take them well beyond their capabilities and skill sets, with dire consequences. But equally, underconfidence can lead people to not speak up when they should. So what is the optimal amount of confidence that can get the most out of people without causing problems? That's what my guest this time, Professor Don Moore, is here to help me answer. He's a professor at the Berkeley Haas School of Business, formerly at Carnegie Mellon, and he's written a book called Perfectly Confident that explores what we know about confidence and how we can appropriately calibrate it to get the most out of ourselves and others. It's a topic that I, wait for it, am confident you'll find fascinating and enlightening. So please enjoy my discussion with Professor Moore on being perfectly confident. Don Moore, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Listen, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And I want to start before we get on to talking about confidence and you know how it can be good and bad. I'm fascinated, firstly, by how you got interested in the subject. And then secondly, he said, asking two questions in one. What do you mean by the word confidence?
I stumbled into the topic through a dissertation with a curious and vexing result whose pursuit led me down the long path that has become my research inspiration and my career obsession. So I got this strange result in my dissertation where I was examining the role of time pressure in negotiation, where you put buyer and seller under time pressure, tell them they have a deadline, and the buyer thinks, oh, this is going to work to my disadvantage. I'm going to have to pay a higher price. And the seller thinks, oh, this deadline, it's going to work to my disadvantage. I'm going to not get as high a price. They can't both be right. They're both thinking that this deadline is bad for them. It sounds like a conspicuous example of underconfidence. And chasing that down and understanding how it related to the other ways that psychologists had studied confidence and overconfidence and underconfidence led to a series of profound insights that allow me to answer your other question. What is this all about? What is the study of confidence? Psychologists have studied confidence in three ways. One is estimation. Overestimation is thinking that you're better than you are. The second, overplacement, is the exaggerated belief that you're better than others. And the third, overprecision, is the excessive faith that you know the truth. And my research attempts to disentangle those, identify the circumstances in which we're overconfident and the circumstances in which we're underconfident.
So this is amazing, right? Because normally, and I'm hugely exaggerating here, but normally biases work in one way. And what's really interesting about what you're looking at is that it has two different aspects, both of which have positives, but if you push it to extremities, have super negatives. And it's quite interesting that you approach it from a relatively neutral perspective, because when I think about overconfidence, I naturally think of Dunning-Kruger and this idea, for listeners that aren't aware, of sort of a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. But you've neatly balanced this thing, which points to a bias being supremely powerful and yet supremely dangerous if it's tipped off an edge either way.
In my book, I come to the enthusiastic recommendation that you should believe the truth. But getting to the truth is not so easy. And your question identifies the curious possibility that there are some circumstances in which people could think it was in their interest to not believe the truth, and where being overconfident or underconfident could seem like a good thing. And we could talk a long time about the potential benefits of overconfidence or underconfidence. So you could imagine evolutionary stories in which there may have been an ancestral past in which certain forms of overconfidence could have been rewarded. There's an interesting published theory about how if you think that you're tougher than you are and therefore act in such a way as to scare off potential rivals, how that could potentially be evolutionarily stable. My admonition to believe the truth and not be overconfident meets perhaps its most potent challenge in the domain of entrepreneurship, where a lot of people, including coaches and advisors to entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, will say things like, to succeed as an entrepreneur, you've got to be excessively confident. You've got to believe all the odds and the caution be damned that your crazy idea is going to succeed where others have failed. And I think those ideas are interesting and, as you note, extremely dangerous. That it is easy, while you can formulate an argument about how such incorrect beliefs might be helpful under some circumstances, it's going to be just as easy for me to provide counterexamples highlighting the ways that such delusionally confident beliefs can get you into all sorts of trouble.
But it's a beautiful tightrope, right? Because if you tip one way the wrong way, and by a small amount, you'll miss opportunities. So the entrepreneur thing is a great example, because without that degree of confidence, you wouldn't have. And every single example that comes to mind, I can criticize. But let's take Uber. Maybe there's sort of science examples where people kind of pushed it in a way that delivered something amazing. Yeah. And we're all desperately hoping that the coronavirus is cured by someone just in a lab sitting as someone going, screw conventional wisdom, I know better, I'm going to push it and develop something. But equally, it develops idiocy. And on the flip side, the risks are obvious. So there's a really interesting thing here, which is it's a finely balanced, finely honed thing that we've all got. I think our favorite examples of stuff going wrong either way.
Yeah. So by identifying that tightrope and considering the risks on either side, you have neatly captured the challenge that you've talked about in other episodes. The challenge of taking, of avoiding the errors of commission and of omission, of making mistakes, engaging in activities or taking risks that you shouldn't have that wind up failing or getting you into trouble, versus the risk of inaction when you should have acted, opportunities that would have paid off handsomely, investments that would have been successful. And walking the tightrope means avoiding both of those errors on either side. Your question about ventures, risky ventures, and the stories that we like to tell about wild-eyed visionaries and inventors with excessive ambition who wound up being successful, the innovators that we certainly hope are investing now in the possibility of a coronavirus vaccine. There are lots of ways in which we as a society or an economy can benefit from that sort of risk-taking. Undeniably, that is the case. As someone who lives in California, I know firsthand about how much my state and our economy has benefited from bold visionaries and risk takers starting companies. Right. Yes, to win the lottery, it is helpful to buy lottery tickets. You increase your chances of winning.
But it's interesting you even use that analogy, right? Because the lottery presupposes you have an option to play.
But if you're giving advice to someone about how they should spend their scarce resources, how they should invest their limited time, energy, and money, do you want to advise them to buy more lottery tickets? Winning the lottery is made more likely by buying lottery tickets. But the more money you spend on lottery tickets, the poorer you should expect to be in expectation. They have negative expected value. And so although there are positive externalities, schools are funded by the revenues that come in through the national lottery or the state lottery. Is it a wise investment strategy? No, it's a terrible investment strategy. And deluding yourself into thinking, I'm going to win the lottery, I should go buy more tickets. that's a stupid plan, and I would not advise it to anyone I were coaching. I don't practice it myself, and I would not make that recommendation to my students.
I mean, what's amazing here is you are cutting to the chase on pretty much every decision that we take. Right, which is, I mean, there's somewhere I'm not, taking a huge gamble. It's sort of, I'm pretty sure if I walk out of my house, that if I go left, I know what I'm going to come across. If I go right, I'm going to, just in terms of geography, I have no idea who I might meet. But basic decisions where confidence sort of, it's probably baked in sensibly that I have confidence that the door is going to close in the right way, and that the station that I'm walking towards, and I'm ignoring coronavirus dynamics for a second, those things won't have moved. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, every single decision I take has a component of what you're suggesting. And it's even small stuff, and it's particularly, I think, acute. We notice it now where I order, like I'm being super careful not to go out just because I'm lazy, but also because it's the right thing to do. But I kind of go, I don't know whether the store will have that. And then I go, does it matter? But we've got all these, and every single decision we take is baked in with this confidence, underconfidence. You've kind of distilled the essence of human decision making.
Yeah, you're exactly right that every decision depends on a forecast of its outcome. And crucial to thinking through those outcomes is your confidence. How likely do you think it is that this new product that you've come up with will actually be successful in the marketplace? How likely is it that the stock you think is a good investment is going to go up in value? And when I offer words of caution against the risks of overconfidence or excess optimism in these possibilities, I don't want that to be taken as pessimism. I'm not saying, it's not as good as you think it is. And I'm not saying don't take the risk. There are times when taking the risk is the right thing to do, and our natural human tendency towards risk aversion will scare us off. It's also the case that a lot of companies adopt policies that scare their people off, right? If you've come up with a product that stands a chance of hitting it big in the marketplace, some bold, new, revolutionary product that, if it hits, is going to pay off 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1, but the probability of it failing is higher than the probability of it succeeding. What if it just has a 1 in 10 chance of succeeding, but it's going to pay off 100 to 1? That has a positive expected value. You should want to take that risk.
So economically, you do it, right?
Yeah, the company should certainly want you to take that risk. But if the company punishes failures, a wise decision maker with only one career and a family at home to feed might be scared of taking that risk, knowing that failure is more likely than success. And so thinking about how to take risks wisely, and companies in particular have a challenge managing the incentives that they offer their employees, rewarding wise, well-intentioned risk-taking with positive expected value is wise, and you should do it. And that's not overconfidence. That's just smart.
We tend to focus on overconfidence and those TV talent shows where you get it's typically a kid, right, who's been deluded by their parents, which I find even more tragic because it's not an adult making a smart decision. Fine, they might be 19 years old, but it's clear they've emerged from the family and they've heard nothing but "you've got an amazing voice." And then we kind of, and I hate myself for this because we watch it and it's cruel as hell. But we watch this thing and we love the fact that someone is being brought down to earth and their confidence is being shattered in a way that if it happened to us, we would hate. So is it right that society, we're focused much more on that? Because I can think of many more examples where overconfidence is a problem, comedic thing, issue than underconfidence.
Yeah, you've highlighted the errors of commission, the mistakes that we're likely to make based on overconfident beliefs. The errors of omission, the people who could have been great but are scared to enter because they've underestimated their abilities. Those people aren't so visible to us.
Right.
But their error is no less tragic. For all that, underconfidence is a real thing. The imposter syndrome leads people who are capable to think, maybe I don't have what it takes. It leads us to avoid competitions or to exit too quickly. And so giving realistic information to our children, to junior people in our organization, to aspirants or students, that is really valuable. And just stroking their egos or trying to build them up by telling them, you're awesome, you can do anything you want. I don't think that that's always a good thing. Better is to give them a realistic forecast of what they can do and what they can't. Spending their time practicing a sport for a dream to be able to play professionally is for most kids an unrealistic pipe dream. On the other hand, being involved in athletic activity is good for your body. It's good for your mind. It contributes to your longevity and can provide a lifetime of pleasure and reward. So a realistic forecast of what you can expect to get out of some activity can be useful for directing your efforts and suggesting what you should major in college, perhaps.
Or if indeed you choose to go to college, right? Because that may not be your chosen path. But
exactly.
So what I find really interesting about this is it's so easy for people to grasp what you're talking about. And in the book, you pick numerous examples of things where if you haven't heard of it, you can grasp it pretty quickly. But many of the stories you will have heard of. And what I find fascinating is this is so obvious to us that in many respects, you're writing a book that is kind of, let's just document a condition we all understand. Why is it that we don't get this right? Because you would think evolution, which has done many things for us in terms of positives and allowed us to still be here, right, has screwed this one up. Because honestly, if I was to look at one of the major reasons things go wrong in the world today, and I'd love to come on and talk about certain high-profile examples of that, right? Can't think where I'm going with that. But if you look at it, this is a major issue. And I'm partly astonished that no one's written a book about it in the way that you have, but it's like so obvious. And yet we're not self-aware enough as a species to grasp that.
Yeah. I think the information that the world provides us leads us astray in two really obvious ways. One is the information that we observe around us makes it easy for us to confuse correlation with causation. We observe that more confident people succeed in so many walks of life. Athletes, politicians, entrepreneurs. Confidence is tightly correlated with success, and it is tempting for us to conclude from that the confidence contributed to the success. And in so doing, neglect the possibility that confidence and success share the same underlying cause, which is to say, people who are actually more capable, who've practiced harder, who've rehearsed, and therefore have a solid basis for their confidence, they're better prepared for success. And so by confusing correlation and causation, we can fool ourselves into thinking that it's better to have more confidence. But when you test that, the evidence does not always support that belief. The second thing that your question gets at has to do with how we interpret expressions of confidence by others. So if we fooled ourselves into thinking that confidence is somehow causal, then it's easy to take others' expression of confidence as predictive of their future success. But even if we think that both confidence and success is caused by some underlying ability, we observe someone, a political candidate perhaps, expressing a great deal of confidence, and it can be tempting to think, oh, maybe that person actually has the inside line on success. Maybe they are the one who alone can fix it. Maybe if I vote for them, if they get elected, they will provide the magical solution to all the world's ills.
You could sort of make an argument for that, for inexperienced people might conclude that. But what's really interesting, and I'm not just going to pick one example, there are plenty of others, including in one in the UK at the moment, where you have people who've been around for long enough to know better, supporting people who clearly have overconfidence as a major attribute, shall we say. And I find it fascinating that this isn't a sort of I don't know what I'm doing type bias, where a little bit of experience will teach me that I shouldn't trust this, or I should, and it's always understandable with environmental decisions or anything that we get to grips with things over time. But what I find fascinating about the confidence piece is it sticks with people for possibly a lot longer than many other biases that we have. And I'm intrigued by that.
Yeah, I share your fascination with the problem. Why don't people learn? Well, I think there's real information value in the confidence that would-be leaders express. But by selecting the more confident candidates, we are simultaneously, as you know, putting ourselves at risk of selecting the overconfident ones. And I think it's too easy to pay attention to the outward display of confidence, and many of us are not. We don't ask tough enough questions about evidence backing up those confident claims. What's the track record look like? Is the story that they're telling about the magical solutions they're offering, is that plausible? What can we say about the causal claims that they've identified or the predictions that they've made? Can we test those confident beliefs that they've put out there, or the assurances that they've made so boldly? And what we'd really like to see is evidence and a track record backing up the confident claims of would-be leaders and political candidates. We don't ask those tough questions enough.
And do you think that comes from the fact that we don't necessarily ask ourselves those tough questions? And therefore, this is an attribute that we're not assessing an environment, we're assessing another person. And so we deploy hypothesis, obviously feel free to destroy, that we assess ourselves on a basis that says, I ignore things that are inconvenient, and therefore I'll just use the same lens that I use of myself to judge someone else. Is that a fair perception? Or
yeah, I think you've tapped into something really important there. Confident beliefs can feel good. They are deeply comforting. It is a balm on the soul to think that you're right. It is much more threatening to the ego to consider the possibility that you might be wrong. But it is nevertheless advice that I offer in my book. Ask yourself why you might be wrong. Question your beliefs. All of us are too prone to being sure that we have the right answer, to think that those who disagree with us must be either stupid because they can't see the facts in front of their faces, or evil because they're pushing some sort of misguided agenda. When the fact is, for so many aspects of life, whether it's political partisanship or business agendas, that there's the possibility that smart people paying attention to the same facts come to different conclusions. And asking about people who disagree with you, what do they know that I don't? How have they interpreted the facts, or what other facts might they know that I don't, is very useful for helping you calibrate your own confidence in your judgment, and helping you examine the weaknesses in your own perspective or your own argument. Weaknesses that might trip you up, or weaknesses that might lead you to make a mistake of either action, pursuing some possibility that turns out to be a mistake, or errors of inaction, where you fail to take action that would have turned out well.
And I'm struck when you're talking that there's a really sort of ironic dynamic here, which is the very skill set that would allow you to challenge overconfidence is sort of undermined by underconfidence. In other words, there's lots of examples where people were in the room, proverbial or real, who could have said something but chose not to. And we can pick examples that range from the Holocaust through to more recent political things, and we know it in our own family, where or even just work meetings, where someone in the room knows this is BS or just not the right call, and for some reason they don't say something. So we're equipped to be able to challenge each other and kind of work and bounce off each other. And yet the very dynamic that would help mitigate the risks that you've just outlined is destroyed in many respects by the opposite. And I'm really intrigued by, I mean, that seems like an evolutionary failure.
Listening to those quiet voices in the meeting or in our heads, the voice that says, but what about this? Or have you considered this perspective? Or how might someone else perceive the actions we're about to take? That is an enormously valuable perspective. It happens sometimes in high-profile decisions at the University of California, where I work, when someone asks, how would this story look blasted across the front page of the newspaper? How would we feel about this if the San Francisco Chronicle put it on the front page? That is a very useful perspective, getting the outside view. Danny Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about the value of the outside view. Getting outside of your narrow perspective, getting outside of your head and asking, how does this look from someone else's perspective? You're betting on the success of some new venture or product innovation. Well, how does this look from the outside? How often have ventures like this succeeded on average in the past? Getting that outside perspective is enormously helpful for putting a cautious view on an idea that you can be deeply in love with from the inside.
Right.
But that you really ought to appreciate its potential weaknesses from the outside, right? You're in love with this product or you're in love with this person. What does it mean to know that 50% of marriages end in divorce? Could that apply here? And what are the weaknesses of this venture that you're so in love with?
That makes perfect sense as within one's own mind, right? Mm-hmm. So we should be allowing in. So we have this crudely simple thing, but on the left side we've got confidence, right side overconfidence. Confidence is sort of balance, so we balance. And I'd love to think of a yin and yang thing, recognizing that can't happen because we're pre-programmed to be super, to sort of back ourselves to survive, I guess. But there's an interesting societal thing, which is that one of the benefits of being a sort of tribal species is that for the stuff that we can't do, someone else compensates. So there's lots of examples where it works to, marriage or at least partnership works as a thing because they can compensate for you and vice versa. And so I would look at this and go, nature or evolution ought to have played its role of saying, okay, the way I will make sure that I kind of dial down the overconfidence or dial up the underconfidence is that I'll bring someone else into their sphere that brings the opposite, a sort of challenger to over underconfidence. And that doesn't seem to happen. Yeah. I'm intrigued why we don't.
I think part of the answer might come from the tension between the group interest and the individual interest. So why don't we tamp down entrepreneurs' overconfidence? Well, part of the reason why is that society benefits from their recklessness. That as a culture, we benefit from some overconfident beliefs. That we benefit from those who believe too much in themselves, who are willing to sacrifice for the greater good, even though it's not in their individual interests. And here we have culture sometimes at odds with evolutionary pressure, where, yes, our culture celebrates the sacrifice of heroes who go into battle. Maybe that's a military battle, right. Maybe it's an economic battle, and sacrifice their own welfare for the larger collective good. Is that a wise strategy that I would recommend to my kid to pursue? No, I would encourage them to be better calibrated in their confidence judgments.
Right. As we think about these things, you've spent time looking at this, and I'm not expecting the answer to be, I have this sorted, and I'm writing it. because then you'd sit in the overconfident religious cult spectrum. You've written a book about this and you've looked at it. What do you do to calibrate this piece? And it's a slightly leading question, I know, because you do pick this up in the book, but I think it's really worth exploring. We recognize this dynamic. What the hell can we do about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. We can sometimes solve it interpersonally, as you suggested, by assigning people to the role of the devil's advocate to speak against the motion on the table, to speak against the plan currently under consideration. In the book, I talk about the role that the devil's advocate played in considering candidates for canonization. So it was the person at the deliberations about sainthood who spoke for the devil against the blessed and tried to make the case against sainthood. In our deliberations about granting someone a job for life within the university system, in our personnel committee meetings, there's someone assigned to the con case who speaks against the candidate for tenure to say why their case isn't as strong as it might first appear and to highlight weaknesses within that case. There are some times that you can help yourself solve this problem by asking, as I suggested, why might I be wrong? Courageous leaders will pick people who help them ask that question, who point out the flaws in their argument. And in particular, there's a useful way to think about this problem that Annie Duke, the poker player, highlights in her book, right, Thinking in Bets, where she talks about how poker players challenge each other. When someone makes a claim that isn't particularly credible, their poker buddies will ask, "Want to bet?" Invite someone else to put stakes on their implausible claim. And you can do this for yourself, asking yourself, would I be willing to bet on that? So I think that something's going to happen. I think that some stock is going to go up. I think some project is going to be successful. I think that I'll do well if I go on Britain's Got Talent. I'm sure I'll win the top prize. How much am I willing to bet on that? And thinking about the prospect as a risky bet, where you put your money down on what you say you think is going to happen, is a useful way of disciplining the process of forecasting a rosy future.
You highlight ancient, and I'm exaggerating slightly to make a point, ancient structures, right? So you've got devil's advocate. You could argue the Joker in a kind of royal court played the same role, which is a sort of risk management challenging piece. And we've designed structures that sort of are supposed to incorporate that piece around sort of having bicameral legislature and independence of the judiciary. There's a whole host of sort of things. And yet what we see around us is that's being steadily undermined. And so I think what you've written is very timely, because we need to think about these particular pieces. But it's interesting that this was known about way back when. And they kind of went, this is too hard, right? So the way we solve this problem is not to assume that people will change, but we'll build structures on the presumption they won't. And structures that are now being super tested around that piece. And I'm intrigued as to your thoughts about, do we need to double down on the structures of or maybe reinstate? Because you could argue they've been undermined. How do we even think about handling these dynamics? Because what you're basically talking about is the fundamental human condition. And that's why these historic examples are still relevant.
Yeah. Your question highlights a dilemma that I think about sometimes in the context of the following juxtaposition, that we, as a species, we have Stone Age brains, medieval institutions, and space age technology. And it is easy to see the ways in which our technological tools are insufficiently controlled by our medieval institutions, and our Stone Age brains get us into all sorts of trouble trying to navigate these complex institutions and space age technologies, and we misuse them to our detriment in so many ways. Figuring out how to navigate that better, how to teach imperfect humans to responsibly use the enormously powerful technological tools that we are innovating at a reckless pace. It's not an easy problem to solve, especially with slow-moving medieval institutions whose regulations always respond too slowly to the challenges put forward by fast-moving markets and high technology.
I've never heard that articulation before, and I love it because it really resonates with me. But I mean, if we turn to the C word, which permeates all of our existence at the moment, there's a really interesting example of where we need to keep all of those confidence dynamics in check. Mm-hmm. And we need to because we don't want to give up the fight, because it'd be perfectly possible to sit there and go, and I always use sort of Independence Day as an example, right? The aliens have landed, we'll let them run the show. And you might go, they couldn't do a worse job, right? But let's put that in. So we need to keep fighting, and even fighting is an interesting depiction of it, because that brings also, particularly in the UK, we have this issue about people go back to the Second World War, which is not necessarily helpful, particularly with our relationship with Europe. Let's park that for a whole separate discussion. I think this thing and go. So we need the balance of confidence and overconfidence. So you can have leaders, and we see this possibly in your country and mine, where there's a supreme degree of self-confidence that leads them to announce it's all okay. And equally, we don't want someone that sits there and goes, it's all gone to hell. Right? Hellfire and damnation is awful. And I think we're in a really interesting space, right, where we need to balance those two things out. And I'm intrigued by how you see that, and whether you see a path to solving this, or are we going to, as my perception tells us, that we kind of bounce between, here's someone that's overconfident, that's ridiculous. Here's someone that's underconfident. That's also naive and ridiculous. And I'll have to self-calibrate because the system that we've built up almost implicitly in the devil's advocate case for, I don't know what the opposite was, demonstrates that we're required to, we like a bit of bouncing around.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right that it is so tempting to give ourselves over to leaders who say, I've got this figured out. I know the way forward. It's all going to be fine. By summer, the virus will have evaporated.
I think it was Easter. I think was the guarantee you had. But
I believe you're right.
Mine is slightly further out, but similarly interesting.
And the case of the coronavirus highlights with painful poignance how our leaders' overconfidence can get our nations into so much trouble by expressing tremendous confidence that it was all going to be fine. We got this under control. Donald Trump forestalled the preparation that might have avoided some of the colossal costs that the United States is paying right now. What's the alternative? So I completely agree with you that underconfidence is not the right answer either. I think it takes a special kind of courageous leadership to provide honest information about the risks ahead, the perils that we face, and the costs we're going to have to pay in order to meet the challenge the future has laid before us. Now, it's possible that I am I'm giving humanity too much credit here, but I hold out hope for a scientific perspective that can calibrate our belief in magical cures, for instance, and leads us to realistic expectations about how the virus is likely to spread through society and the possibility that we're going to have an effective vaccine within 6, 12, 18 months. That we face a long road ahead, and getting honest information about when we might expect a cure and what we might expect from the economy in the meantime is enormously valuable. At the same time, I will completely acknowledge the unsatisfying nature of scientific uncertainty that in the past few months, as the public's demand for answers has grown, that the press and the world has turned its attention to the making of the scientific sausage in a way that has exposed those uncertainties and imperfections, and it led to some disillusionment with the scientific process. If there were a better alternative, I would be enthusiastic about turning there. In reality, there is much we don't know about the future. And turning to those who know the most, who've studied it, that often means scientists, I think is probably our best option for coming closer to the truth.
Do you think that confidence or lack of confidence is a proxy for, or a response to, rather, a lack of certainty? So we have to deal with a world that is uncertain. And so what we do is we kind of have to go one way or the other. And so we handle that piece, not by embracing the uncertainty, but by just going, I need to go one way or the other. Right? It's much easier for me to paint a hellfire and damnation picture that almost just goes, yeah, you can start to understand the rationale of people that go and protest against lockdowns, who say it's all made up and this is sort of, you're being brainwashed, who will soon, I suspect, find themselves in the ICU. But let's not. Versus the opposite thing, which is like, is that just a response to the fact that we don't have certainty? So it's easier for us to go, and I'm painting a really binary picture, but is it easy? Is that part of the thing here?
Yeah. You've tapped into a couple key issues. One has to do with different types of confidence and the frequent confusion between optimism, how good or bad do you think the future is going to be, and certainty, that is, how sure or unsure are you? And I think it's worth disentangling those two, because you can be delusionally optimistic and be too sure about that, or you can think that you're worse than you are and be too sure about that. I think so I would advocate realism both in estimating how good or bad the future is going to be and confronting the uncertainty inherent in that future. Let me just note the essential value in thinking probabilistically. So you talked about how attractive it can be to go to the extremes, to act like you can predict with certainty what's going to happen or what's not, to imagine that there are answers out there, that maybe there's a conspiracy that's really working behind the scenes, and that if only you understand the magic codes, you can figure out what's going to happen, or whether Bill Gates engineered the coronavirus to control the world. The reality is that there is no puppet master back there who has all the answers, that the truth, that the future is uncertain, and the best way to think about those uncertainties is as a probability distribution. So, will we have a vaccine in 12 months? We don't know for sure. There are lots of uncertainties. Will unemployment surpass 25%? We don't know. The way to think about an uncertain future is as a probability distribution. To pretend like you know how the coin flip is going to come out is just foolishness. You don't know how it's going to come out, and the most honest representation is a probability distribution. 50% chance of heads, 50% chance of tails. And when you think about futures like economic growth in the face of the coronavirus, or the prospects for an explosion in cases that will overwhelm the healthcare system and leave millions dead, well, that is a real possibility depending on how we manage the public health crisis in the coming weeks and months. Thinking about those risks and those possibilities are all part of the uncertainty inherent in looking into the future. And forecasting that future is best thought of as a probability distribution rather than some sort of prediction problem where a smart person, if only they knew enough, would know for sure what was going to happen.
Yeah. No, I was giggling about the number of people that are still peddling certainty in this uncertain world. And they're a dwindling bunch, but they still clearly exist. Look, I want to make sure that we conclude the podcast on a positive note.
That might be a challenge given where we've come.
Not that it hasn't been a supreme pleasure, but I'm always conscious that it's very important, not least because of the behavioural science peak end rule, which listeners who aren't aware should look up to understand. But we do need to clear on that, because I do want people to read your book and not think this is another doom and gloom piece. So if we sort of look at what you've discovered and the things that we understand, what reasons do we have to be optimistic about the way that our brain operates to deliver these apparently challenging and messed up dynamics where we'll go one way or the other? Is there something we can grasp from all this that just goes, here's a way out? And here's a way you can think about these dynamics that can make things better for you, rather than just highlight how suboptimal our thinking is.
Without a doubt. Thank you for that optimistic invitation. And I'll answer in two ways. One is by highlighting tools for helping our Stone Age brains think probabilistically in more sophisticated ways about uncertain futures. As gratifying as it can be to think simplistically about predictions, pretending as if we know what's going to happen, the truth is there are some fairly simple tools that can help all of us acknowledge the uncertainty that we face and to think about that in more sophisticated ways. When companies ask me for help forecasting product demand, for instance, every company has to forecast product demand. The way most do it is to invite the person who knows the most, the product manager, to make a point prediction. What are sales going to be next quarter? And then they base their production quantities on that. Well, there is a very simple tool for helping everybody get better at thinking about that forecasting problem. It's not going to be that number. Pretending like you can make a point prediction for what sales are going to be next quarter, it's just simple fantasy.
Well, particularly now, right?
Yeah. Lots of companies realize how imperfect their forecasts for this quarter were.
Right.
Think about the range of possibilities. Take the range of possible sales and break that up into a set of mutually exclusive and exhaustive bins, and then assign probabilities to those bins. How likely is it that sales double? How likely is it that sales drop to zero? How likely is it that sales are a quarter of where they were a year ago? A quarter to a half to three quarters. Think about the range of possibilities and how likely each of those is. That helps everyone involved get better calibrated in thinking through uncertainties. That is a simple fix you can use in many circumstances in life. And the other way I would respond to your invitation to think more optimistically is to just highlight the real risks of underconfidence that are present in so many domains. In hard tasks, all of us are prone to thinking that we're worse than others when we're not. If I ask my students in class to rank themselves relative to their classmates in their juggling abilities, or in how many companies that they'll found, on average, they rate themselves below average in these difficult tasks. That's a mistake, just as much of it as it is a mistake to think that you're better than others when you're not. And falling victim to the imposter syndrome, thinking that we're worse than we actually are, that we're not up to the task when we are, that's a mistake. All of us have vast untapped potential, and appreciating the magnificent opportunities for success, for glory, for fulfillment, for pleasure is an extremely empowering and enlivening message I hope everyone will take away from reading my book.
I love that because, and I'm going to ask you one more question because I know I said I wouldn't, but hey, I'm confident now. But like, so you've asked them. So typically the question would be framed in a positive way, right? Which is sort of what do you think you're going to do? And you've asked them something that is less likely. And so if you calibrate, I presume you're not just picking one particular thing, but you look at a range of where they might see themselves. I'm assuming there's a thing that sort of says we can predict one end of the spectrum, which is everybody's overconfident on stuff they ought to be overconfident on. And yet they're underconfident on the things that are less well known and less obvious. Is that sort of how to see this? And therefore your point around your ability to start a business is undercooked because somehow in the psyche, that's a less, I don't know, particularly if you're female, I guess, that's a less prevalent, there are less role models, there's less stories, there's less data that supports that.
That'll lead to uncertainty. Actually, where we observe people thinking that they're worse than others when they're not is when they're bad relative to some salient standard. So most people aren't very good at juggling. And they think, maybe there's someone out there in the class who knows how to juggle. Right. Most people don't know much Latin. And so when you ask, how much Latin do you know relative to your classmates? On average, they think they're below average in this on this difficult task. You ask people, how likely would you be to succeed in some really challenging or obscure business skill? And on average, people would say, I'm worse than others. On the other hand, for a common skill or a common task, people will, on average, say they're better than others. My students say that they're better than 90% of their classmates on honesty. Most people are honest about most things most of the time, and it can be hard for them to tell whether others are being honest since they don't know what those others really believe. And so on easy tasks, it's easy to think that you're better than others when you're not. On hard tasks, it's easy to think that you're worse than others when you're not.
Wow. What a great... As you were talking, I had one... This is going to be my parting shot for the listeners, which is the weather forecast. Right? Which, if ever there was an exercise where we ought to be getting better at it, and we're not, it's that. So I watch, and I live in London, and they talk about the weather in London like it's a very tight sort of single system, geographic unit. And it's not. It's like you go a couple of miles one way or the other. Not at the moment, clearly, listeners, but ordinarily you go, and the weather system changes. So this idea that you have a weather forecast for London is utter nonsense and really unhelpful because because what do I care about? What clothes am I wearing? Have I got an umbrella? That's all I care about. And yet they get that wrong. And so there's this, and the bit I love about it is they're prepared to broadcast it. And so you have people standing there making statements about what the weather's going to do for a territory where that is clearly nonsense. And so as I look at the sort of positive thing, I sort of go, if the professionals whose job it is to forecast that stuff don't quite get it right, there's a way that we should probably cut ourselves some slack based on what you've just told us around stuff that we have even less visibility and experience in.
Amen.
Look, thank you so much. I knew it was going to be fun, but it was such a lot of fun, and I'm really inspired by what you say. And thank you for closing us out nicely.
It's been a pleasure.
That's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Don for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Perfectly Confident and Don's research, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those things there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe to it wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. If listeners who like the show had an opportunity to give it a 5-star review, that would be hugely appreciated. It really does help. I'll be back with another episode of this podcast very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe, remain perfectly confident, and thanks for listening.